want to ask you a question. I just want you to think about your answer in the quietness of your own heart. Here it is. What does God say about sex? Just answer that question inside of your mind, inside of your heart right now. What does God say about sex? What if we entered into this time right now where I took a handheld mic and I just said, man, we're gonna pass it around to every single person in this arena, and I want you to share your answer to this question. What do you believe God says about sex? What do you think we would hear? I think I know what we would hear. I think that we would hear three different answers repeated over and over and over. When it comes to what does God say about sex, I think that we would either hear, I don't know. Number two, I don't care. Or number three, God says don't have sex before marriage. So if we know anything about what God says about sex, it's that we are to not have sex before marriage. We don't know why he doesn't want us to have sex before marriage. We just know that God thinks that it's a sin, and so we shouldn't do it. So if there's anything that we know, it's what not to do. Now, think about this. If I were to go a different way with it, and I were to say, okay, now tell me what the rest of the world says about sex. And we were to pass a microphone around this place, just think, what would your answer be? I think we would hear the exact opposite. Whereas God tells us what not to do, I think that we would hear a lot more answers describing what you are to do. And many of you would get more long-winded because we have movies and we have TV shows and we have music and we have social media that are constantly educating us about sex. These things tell us when to have sex. You want to know when you should have sex? Whenever you can get it. Tells us who you should have sex with. You should have sex with whoever will give it to you. You want to know where you should have sex? You should have sex wherever you can find a place to do it. And if you need suggestions, Ludacris has written a song where he just rattles off different places you can have sex, like on the 50-yard line of the Georgia Dome or on the top of his Escalade, which doesn't sound very comfortable, but that's a viable option according to Ludacris. How should you have sex? Quickly and passionately. It would seem that the world has a lot to say about sex. Now, I can't speak for everyone in this room, and I don't know if this is true of everyone in this room, but I would imagine that there are a good amount of people in this world who want to and hope to experience good sex. I don't think that I'm going out on a limb to believe that the majority of the people in this room want to and hope to experience good sex. So if you're evaluating where good sex will be found, whether it's God's way or the world's way, which way seems to be more promising? Well, if God's way is don't and the world's way is do, then it would seem that God's way really falls short and can't begin to compare with what the world has to offer us. That's why about 70% of people have had their first sexual experience by the age of 19, because it would appear that the world has much more to offer us than God does. Now, I want you to think about this. Every invention usually comes with an instruction manual on how to use it, right? The majority of inventions come with an instruction manual on how to use it. And every good instruction manual tells you what to do, but it also tells you what not to do. So I talked about the instruction manual for the iPad just a couple weeks ago. The instruction manual for the iPad absolutely tells you what to do to enjoy the apps and experience everything that the iPad has to offer. But the instruction manual also tells you not to drop, burn, or puncture your iPad. It tells you what not to do. Any good instruction manual tells you what to do and what not to do. I believe that God is the inventor of sex. I think it was his idea. I think that sex was a product of God's limitless creativity and infinite goodness. I believe that he's the one that invented sex. And as the inventor of sex, I believe that he's given us an instruction manual for sex, but it is my conviction that the majority of us only know what God says not to do when it comes to sex. And just to be clear, God's instruction manual does tell us what not to do when it comes to sex. I'll give you some examples. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 3 through 8 says this. It says, "For this is the will of God." God is spelling out for us his will when it comes to sexuality. He says, for this is the will of God, your sanctification. That means that you look different than the rest of the world. He's saying my way looks different than the world's way. That you abstain from sexual immorality. That's why the majority of us would say the one thing that I know about God's way is that you should not have sex until marriage. Abstain from sexual immorality. He goes on, verse 4, that each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. That no one transgress and wrong his brother in this matter, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things, as we told you beforehand and solemnly warned you. For God has not called us for impurity, but in holiness. Therefore, whoever disregards this disregards not man, but God who gives his Holy Spirit to you. So Paul is outlining for us what we should not do. In another place in Ephesians 5:3, Paul says this. He says, but among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity. And so I think that God's instruction manual has absolutely told us what not to do. I think that God has made it clear that pornography is not God's will for your life. I think that God has made it clear that hooking up is not God's will for your life. I think that this verse especially even tells us that it is not God's will for you to have sex or even to mess around in a committed dating relationship or even in the midst of engagement. I think that God has made it clear to us what not to do when it comes to sex. But let's just be clear. Any good instruction manual doesn't just tell you what not to do, it also tells you what to do. And many of us have never encountered God's true instruction manual when it comes to sex. I don't know if you realize this, but God has devoted an entire book in his Bible to the topic of romantic love. It's called the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon is 8 chapters devoted to finding love, making love, and maintaining love. And within the book of Song of Solomon, there's actually 2 sex scenes. Like, this is not a book that you should read if you're in heat right now. It's not. Just keep it on the shelf, okay? Flip to something else. But in the Song of Solomon, God tells us the who and the how and the where. And he gives us all of the things that we feel like the world gives us regarding sex. God gives us the answers to those questions. When you should have sex, where you should have sex, how you should have sex, who you should have sex with. God answers those questions. He actually tells us what to do in the Song of Solomon. Did you know that? Well, I want to make sure that everyone here leaves tonight. You might not have to agree with God, but you absolutely need to be clear that God is the one who invented sex. And he is pro-pleasure. And he is pro-sex. And he wants you to enjoy it. And he wants you to have good sex. That's why he wrote it into his Bible, so that you have clarity. So if you have a Bible, I want you to turn with me tonight to Song of Solomon chapter 4. Song of Solomon chapter 4 is where we're going to be tonight. And as you're turning there, if you're not familiar with the Song of Solomon, it was written by King Solomon, and I believe that this book kind of chronicles King Solomon's very first marriage. It chronicles kind of the different stages of Solomon's relationship in his first marriage. And so it's this book that kind of goes back and forth between a guy and a girl, and then sometimes the girl's friends get inserted into the mix, which is very fitting. That just makes sense. But to catch you up on what's been happening, chapters 1 through 3 fill us in on everything that happens in their relationship prior to marriage. And then the end of chapter 3 shows Solomon showing up to his wedding day. And then the funny thing is that the end of chapter 3 ends with Solomon showing up, and then chapter 4 lands us in the honeymoon suite. Like Solomon, the author, just skips right over the wedding ceremony, which is fitting. It's written by a guy. Like if a girl was writing this book, it'd be very different. Okay, there'd be like there would be about 10 more chapters to the book between chapters 3 and 4. And it would talk about flower arrangements and how it was the best wedding that has ever happened. And it was magical. And it just was love smells great and all this weird stuff that you would talk about in your book. But it was written by a guy. And so Solomon just assumes, you know that there was a ceremony, all right? Like girls dream about their wedding ceremony, guys dream about their wedding night. And so Solomon said, let's just go there and let's unpack it. And so God gives us, and I don't know if I should call it a privilege, but he invites us to be creepers in the honeymoon suite of Solomon and his bride. And some of you guys, I need you to know there's going to be laughing, there's going to be snickering, and some of you are going to be like, I can't believe he's talking about this. I'm just teaching the Word of God. So if you have a problem with it, I apologize, but this is the Word of God, and it says all Scripture is profitable for teaching. So it is what it is. It is what it is. Song of Solomon, chapter 4, is going to show us biblical sex. We've been in a 4-week series on sex. We've looked at virtual sex, casual sex, forced sex, and now we get to biblical sex. And this passage is going to show us 4 key realities that I want you to know about biblical sex. I'll give you the first one right now. Here it is. Biblical sex is truly safe sex. Now, all eyes on me, because this is not sex ed right now. When I said that biblical sex is truly safe sex, I'm not talking at all about wearing protection, and I'm not talking at all about being on birth control. What I am talking about is I'm talking about this type of relationship in which you are fully known and fully loved at the same time. I am talking about this type of relationship where there is intimacy void of any insecurity. That's what I'm talking about when I say that biblical sex is truly safe sex. It's the type of sex that we all long for, a type of connection where there's intimacy with no insecurity. So watch how things play out. Chapter 4, verse 1. Again, we are in the honeymoon suite. Here's what it says. It says, behold, this is the guy talking. This is Solomon talking to his woman. He says, behold, you're beautiful, my love. Behold, you're beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Okay, so just to be clear, Solomon starts out and he uses his words. Way to go, Solomon. That's different than most guys. But he starts talking, and what Solomon does is he just begins to drink in his girl's beauty. And we never find out her name, but he just begins to drink in her beauty. And what we're going to see Solomon do is he's going to start at the top of her body and work his way down. So he starts off, and look at what he says. He says, your eyes are doves behind your veil. Remember, he's a poet here, people. He says, your hair is like a flock of goats leaping down the slopes of Gilead. We better pause there for some explanation. Because guys, you need to know, on your wedding day, your girl is gonna spend more time on her hair than any other day in the history of her life. And if you show up and you're like, baby, your hair is like goats, you will be single by the end of the night. I assure you, you will be. But, think about it. He says, your hair is like a flock of goats leaping down the slopes of Solomon. This is actually a pretty sensual saying, because what's probably happening here is Solomon is undoing her hair and watching her hair fall down on her shoulders, and it reminds him of maybe the black hair of goats, the beautiful black hair glistening in the twilight. And he's like, baby, that's what your hair reminds me of. Goat's hair. Okay, it must be cultural. It doesn't work. Present day America, stay away from it, men. You'll be better off. Okay, he keeps going. Watch this. This is probably my favorite verse in the chapter, verse 2. Watch this. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins, and not one of them has lost its young. You know what he's saying? He's saying, hey, dental hygiene wasn't what it is today. So he's saying, baby, your teeth are all white and they're all present. Way to go. I love it. There's no gaps up in your grill, and this is incredible. That's what he's saying. So he goes from her eyes to her hair to her teeth. Now verse 3 says your lips are like a scarlet thread. He's talking about her red lips. He says your mouth is lovely. He says your cheeks are like halves of a pomegranate behind your veil. You ever seen inside of a pomegranate? It's pink. He's saying you have rosy cheeks. Verse 4. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built in rows of stone. He's saying, baby, your neck is really thick. That's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. He's saying so much of this is cultural that he's saying your neck is elegant. He says, on it hang 1,000 shields, all of them shields of warriors. He's talking about her necklace. And now verse 5, here we go. He says, I'm back in middle school. He says, your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle that graze among the lilies. Now, I want to be clear, like Solomon isn't like taking inventory of his girl's body. He's not like hair, check, eyes, check, teeth, present, breasts, you got them. Like, that's not what's happening here. He's not taking inventory. He's not examining her. He's admiring her. And commentators believe that with each thing that he mentions, he touches it. And so I want you to think about this. It is possible that this is the first time that this woman's breasts have ever been touched by a man. So I want you to just think, if you wanted to get near to deer and touch the deer, how would you do it? Like, would you run up to him like, hey, what's going on? Get in here for the real thing. Like, is that how you would approach two deer if you wanted to get near them and touch them? No, you move slowly and you move gently, which is really interesting because if you think about it, if this is the first time that this woman's body had ever been touched in that area, this is a moment of vulnerability that she's never experienced in her life, where she's experiencing exposure like never before. And what does Solomon do? He puts her interests first. He moves slowly and he moves gently. I need you to see, we talked about virtual sex on week 1. I need you to see how pornography can be a threat to your future marriage. Because what pornography will do over time is it will distort your expectations of what your spouse needs and wants. And if you're not careful, you're going to show up to your wedding night thinking you're stepping into a pornographic film, when in actuality, you're stepping into someone's most vulnerable moment. And the only way to proceed in that moment is slowly, carefully, gently, respectfully. You see right here, men, he's not driven by lust. He's not out to get. He's out to give. He's fueled by love. 1 Corinthians 13 says that true love does not seek its own. That's why some of you guys in the heat of the moment, you tell someone, I love you. That's why you say it right after you connect with someone in a deep physical way. You say, I love you, but what you really should say is, I lust you. Because you're driven by this intense desire to get, and when you get what you want, something in you wants to say thank you in the form of I love you. But true love isn't about getting, it's about giving. And that's what Solomon is doing. He's giving her comfort and security. Watch this, verse 6. It says, until the day breathes and the shadows flee. What's that? That's the sunrise. I will go away to the mountain of myrrh and the hill of frankincense. Some believe that he's talking about her breasts right there, but he goes on, verse 7, says, you are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you. Some believe that he's talking about her breasts. Some believe he's just talking about her whole body. Either way, he's saying, man, we're going to enjoy our time together. We're not going to move quickly. This is going to be a night process of us just enjoying life together. And then right here in verse 7, he says, you're altogether beautiful, my love. There's no flaw in you. Isn't it interesting? Like, he starts out by saying, you are beautiful. You are beautiful. And then it's like he begins to move down her body. He goes from her eyes to her hair to her lips, talks about her teeth, moves to her breasts, and then it's like, okay, hey, let me just pause. Let's take an intermission and let me begin to affirm you again. Isn't that awesome? Ladies, wouldn't you like a guy to talk to you like this? Wouldn't you love to be in a situation where a guy is putting your interests first and it's all about affirmation and adoration of who you are? Men, I want you to see what Solomon is doing here. Again, he's not driven by lust, he's driven by love. And so he spends so much time talking. He's using his words, and his goal is affirmation and adoration. Why? Because many women, not all women, but many women already lean towards insecurity when it comes to their bodies. And so you think about this girl who is in possibly the most vulnerable moment of her life to this point. This might be the first time ever when she has been naked before a man. So talk about vulnerability. And there's this tendency in many women, again, not all women, but there's this tendency towards insecurity about certain aspects of their bodies. And it differs with each girl. And so what Solomon is strategically doing is he's trying to create an environment where there's intimacy void of insecurity. He's trying to remove any insecurity from the moment. His communication to her is, you are safe here. This is a place where you are admired. This is a place where you are adored. And look at what he says. Verse 7, this is so powerful. He says, there is no flaw in you. Do you think that that's a true statement? No, it's not. She absolutely had flaws. Because every single one of us have flaws. Unless your body has been airbrushed or photoshopped, your body has flaws. But Solomon is able to look at her in this very vulnerable moment, and he's able to affirm her and say, for me, there's no flaws in you. Imagine the safety and security that she felt in that moment. See, that's what biblical sex does. Biblical sex is truly safe sex where you can step into an environment and feel fully known and fully loved. There's safety and security. See, this is the problem. We talked about virtual sex and casual sex the first 2 weeks. The problem with virtual sex and casual sex, the problem with the world's understanding of sex is that the norm is to go through life having multiple sexual experiences with multiple partners. And so your life should just be one big episode of the TV show How I Met Your Mother, where your life is about just kind of all your different sexual experiences with people you slept with until you met the woman that you were supposed to settle down with. I was watching this MTV interview with Channing Tatum, and they said, hey, have you looked at pornography in the last 6 months? He said, yeah. They said, the last 6 weeks? He's like, yeah. They're like, the last 6 days? He's like, yeah. They're like, the last 6 hours? He was like, what time is it? Just kind of pridefully. But what pornography does is it exposes you to many virtual sexual partners. See, that's the norm in this world, that you go through life having multiple sexual experiences with multiple partners. The problem with that is that the more sexual experiences that you have, the more you have to compare with your future spouse. And so when you step into your marriage, you have all of these different images, all of these different experiences that your future spouse now has to compete with. And so just watch how things can play out. If you step into marriage and your spouse's body in a particular area doesn't measure up to someone else's body that you've been with in the past, and you compare the two, then that particular aspect of your spouse's body becomes a flaw. And where you see a flaw, there will be a lack of appreciation. And where there is a lack of appreciation, there will be a lack of affirmation. And where there's a lack of affirmation, there will be insecurity. So I need you to hear me say this. You have an opportunity now to make decisions that will guard your future spouse against having to compete for your affection. Do you hear what I'm saying? You have an opportunity now to begin making choices that will guard your future spouse against having to compete for your affection. one of the best things that you can do is starve your mind of other sexual experiences so that when you show up into your marriage, you can look at your spouse, whether it's your husband or wife, and say, there is no flaw in you. And let me just say this real quick. If you're here and you have many sexual experiences in your past, the good news is that you have Jesus Christ on your side. And Jesus Christ is in the business of newness. So you don't need to feel like you've already failed and it's already a lost cause. No. His mercies are new every moment. This is a new opportunity. You can begin making choices now that I promise you God will bless. The first key reality I need you to know about biblical sex is that biblical sex is truly safe sex. The next reality I need you to know is this: biblical sex insists on maximum pleasure. Do you see that? Biblical sex insists on maximum pleasure. Look at what it says in verse 9. It says, you have captivated my heart, my sister, my bride. You have captivated my heart with one glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace. Verse 10. He says, how beautiful is your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice. Verse 11. Your lips drip nectar, my bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue. The fragrance of your garments is like the fragrance of Lebanon. So I don't know if you saw it, but one of the best things to do when you're reading the Bible is to highlight the repeated words or phrases. What did we see Solomon say multiple times? He referred to his girl as his sister and as his bride. So what we see here with Solomon and his girl is that there is an emotional and a spiritual connection before there's a physical connection. He calls her his sister, indicating that they know each other very deeply, almost like a brother and sister are well acquainted with each other. Not only that, they are brothers and sisters under God. God is their heavenly Father, and they are part of the same spiritual family. So there's this emotional connection where they've had different experiences where they've gotten to know each other, and then combined with that emotional connection, there's a spiritual connection. Now, what I want you to see happening here is that there's an emotional connection and a spiritual connection that are already fueling pleasure. Like Solomon talks about his sister and his bride, and he says, one glance of your eyes, just one jewel in your necklace drives me crazy. Your love captivates me. See, he's already moving towards pleasure, and they haven't even gone below her waist yet. There's been no sex, no orgasm yet. This is just Solomon saying this emotional and this spiritual connection, do something to me. Now, here's the interesting thing. Our world that we live in believes that pleasure is ultimate. Like hedonism is not just suggested, it's expected. That you would live your life in pursuit of pleasure. Now, what our world would say, and all you have to do is look out into the world to see that everything in our world has become hypersexualized. Our world believes that sex is the ultimate fulfillment of pleasure. That sex is the ultimate source of pleasure. But the interesting thing is that our world separates the physical from the emotional and spiritual. So several years ago, there's a song that came out by a group called the Bloodhound Gang, in which they sang these words. They said, you and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel. What are they saying? They're saying, hey, we're just physical beings. Let's get together. Let's have a physical intersection, and then that's it. That's all we are. This is just a physical act between two people. And you can even read up on the hookup culture on college campuses, and people will actually recommend separating the physical from the emotional and the spiritual. The problem with that is that when you separate the physical from the emotional and spiritual, you cap the amount of pleasure that you can experience. Because what Solomon is showing us is that the emotional and the spiritual can actually enhance pleasure. It can take you to new levels of pleasure. Do you know what this means? It means that God is actually more pro-pleasure than the rest of the world. Because the rest of the world says, man, physical activity, physical connection is where you peak out with pleasure. But God's saying, no, man, that's not the ceiling. No, you start with an emotional and spiritual connection, and it unlocks new levels of pleasure that you can experience, because when the emotional and the spiritual are then combined with the physical, they compound together to produce pleasure. I'll just tell you this. In my own marriage, Kat and I have been married 11 and a half years. And there are still regularly moments where I look at my wife and say, I cannot believe I get to be married to her. And you want to know when I have those thoughts? It's when we're laying in bed at night laughing uncontrollably because we've laid there trying to outwit each other. Humor's a big deal to us. And she's just more funny than I am. And so when I think that I've gotten her, she says something that's like, I can't even respond to that. And I love it because my stomach hurts because we're laughing so hard. And I just think I'm so glad that I get to be married to her. Or when I hear about her, when I hear her talk about the Lord, or when she gives me some spiritual insight that's like, yeah, that's exactly what I need to hear. Thanks. Thank you so much. That's incredible. Like, it does something to me where something in me is drawn toward her. And there's pleasure in my wife before there's even been any physical contact. Do you see how God is actually more pro-pleasure than the rest of the world? And what he's saying is, I refuse for my people to settle for anything less than maximum pleasure. But it's going to come when the emotional and the spiritual combine with the physical to compound the pleasure. The third key reality that I need you to know about biblical sex is this. Biblical sex pairs purity with pleasure. Look at what verse 12 says. I want you to know that we are getting extremely intimate here. Solomon says, a garden locked is my sister, my bride, a spring locked, a fountain sealed. Solomon is now referring to the most intimate part of his woman's body as a garden. And he is using this imagery of a garden to actually now not just to talk about that aspect of our body, but to actually reference intercourse. They are moving towards intercourse now. And here's what he says. So he's basically saying she's a virgin. He's saying that she has made some tough choices in her life to remain pure. That she has been a virgin. And if you think about that in our society today, it's frowned upon. And some people, I think, even feel shame that they're still virgins. They're embarrassed that they're still virgins. I remember being in summer school in high school, and this guy was being given a hard time because he was still a virgin. This girl, Solomon's bride, has made some tough decisions in her life to remain pure. And so people might look at that and be like, man, she's a virgin. She's been missing out. I mean, just think about all she could be experiencing, but she is choosing to abstain. She's missing out. But is that true? Is she really missing out? I think that the answer is no, because what we see biblical sex doing is it pairs purity with pleasure. Watch how things progress. Verse 13. Solomon is describing her garden. Again, he's not just describing her body part. He's describing their sexual union. He's describing intercourse. He says, your shoots are an orchard of pomegranates with all choicest fruits, henna with nard. Verse 14, nard and saffron, calamu and cinnamon with all trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes with all choice spices. What Solomon is trying to do is he's trying to create a list of a comprehensive list that names all fruits and spices. That's what he's trying to do. He's creating this image of like, your garden is not lacking for any fruit or spices. It is a stocked garden in a way. Now, in the scriptures, what is the only other garden where every spice and fruit existed? It's the Garden of Eden. Do you know what the word Eden stands for? It stands for paradise. What happened in the Garden of Eden? Well, Adam and Eve became one, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. That's where sex happened. Adam and Eve got to experience sex how God intended for it to be experienced. And what Solomon is saying right here is he's saying We have experienced sex how God has intended for it to be experienced. And you know what it is? It is paradise. It's paradise. Verse 15, a garden fountain, a well of living water, flowing streams from Lebanon. Solomon is saying, my girl is turned on. She is. She's aroused. She's turned on. And then verse 16, watch this. The woman speaks for the first time in the whole passage. And what does she say? She says, awake, O north wind. Like, women, lock that away for your wedding night. You want to shock your man just in the heat of the moment? Just be like, awake, O north wind. He will drop dead in that moment. Be incredible. Awake, O north wind, and come, south wind. Blow upon my garden. Let its spices flow. This is interesting because if you were to read the Song of Solomon, you would see for the first 3 chapters, the woman repeats the same thing over and over. She says, do not awaken love before it's time. Do not awaken love before it's time. Do not awaken love before it's time. And then she gets to chapter 4 in the honeymoon suite and she says, awake. Awake. Now's the time. She's waited. See, purity is actually paired with pleasure. And do you see what she says right here? Watch this. She says, let my beloved come to his garden. Do you see that? Let him come to his garden. Why? Because there's been this commitment where they've stood on an altar and said, what's mine is yours. And so there's no pressure here. She's not being pressured into doing something that she's not comfortable with. There's not a guy on the other side saying, if you really loved me, then we would do this. This isn't the moment, the heat of the moment where she's just saying, okay, I don't know if I really want to do this, but I guess we'll just do it anyway and deal with the consequences on the other side. No, this has been a slow-moving process where she is now able to say, it's not just my garden, it's his garden too. This is our sexual experience together, us coming together as one. You can call me old-fashioned. I don't really give a rip. But there is something beautiful about the process of a man and a woman becoming one. It starts with a man calling a girl up and asking her out, not texting, but actually calling or looking her in the eyes and asking her to go on a date. And then he takes her out multiple times and he creates spaces where they can just get to know each other. They can laugh together and share stories together and talk about life together. And that's all it is. It's just getting to know each other. The physical aspect isn't even a part of the relationship to kind of cloud your judgment or keep you in the wrong relationship too long. No, it's just an opportunity for y'all to get to know each other. And after a period of time, you solidify your relationship even more, where you guys are in a serious, committed dating relationship where you're continuing to explore life together and learn as much as you can about each other. And then there comes this moment where a guy goes to a woman's parents and just says, hey, can I marry your daughter? And they say yes. And you have parents saying, yeah, we believe in you guys. And you have friends coming around you saying, man, we just approve of what's going on and we celebrate what God is doing in your lives. And then this guy saves up enough money to buy a ring, just signifying that you're worth it. And then he puts it on your finger and says, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. And then there's this short period of engagement. And yeah, temptation is high and there's this strong desire to be together, but you hold out. Why? Because anything good in life is worth fighting for. And so you don't choose instant gratification, you choose long-term satisfaction, and you hold out until this day comes where the two of you get to stand on an altar and look each other in the eyes. And you commit all of yourself to that person. And you say, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I don't even have to know what's going to happen between now and the end of my life. I choose to love you for the rest of my life. There's going to be days where I feel like I love you, and there's going to be days where I have to choose to love you. But it doesn't matter. We are together for the rest of our lives, and I'm committed to you. So what do you have? You have this quality time. You have this emotional connection that has been evolving over time. You have this spiritual connection that is constantly growing, and it's all cocooned in this commitment that breeds security and safety, and then you step into the honeymoon suite. And ladies, you can't help but say, you know what, my garden is now his garden. There's no hesitation about giving him access because you want to give him access. Ladies, in my opinion, there's only one guy who deserves access to the most intimate parts of your body, and it's a man who's willing to go through all of that to experience it. It's just my opinion. But do you see what's happening here? Biblical sex pairs purity with pleasure. The last key truth about biblical sex I want you to know is this: biblical sex enjoys freedom. Watch how this scene ends, chapter 5. Solomon's talking again. He says, I came to my garden, my sister, my bride. I gathered my myrrh and my spice. I ate my honeycomb with my honey. I drank my wine with my milk. Have you ever seen wine and milk combined in the same place? Solomon did it somehow. What he's saying is, I did it. And it was incredible. It was incredible. And then someone else speaks into the scene, and I believe it's God speaking. And God speaks in. He's the only one in the wedding chamber with them, and he says, eat, friends, drink, and be drunk with love. Isn't that amazing? The God of the universe cheering them on, saying, eat, friends, drink, be drunk with love. See, there's freedom. There's no guilt or shame. There's no feeling of, I don't know if we should be doing this. There's none of that morning after where it's like, I don't even feel like I can be close to God right now because of what I've just done. Instead, sex in some ways becomes worship where God looks on and says, this is well-pleasing to me for the two of you to become one, because this isn't just some physical act that you guys get together and then go separate ways. No, there's this connection that I have been weaving together for months, if not years now. So eat, friends, drink, be drunk with love. You see that freedom there? No shame, no guilt. No questioning whether you're in or outside of God's will. Just freedom to enjoy God's gift. I want to ask you guys, I want to kind of pull this entire series right here at the end of the series. I want to pull it together for you. There's been tons of people, psychologists, pastors, Kings of Leon, everyone has used the imagery of fire to relate to sex. And so I just want you to think of sex in some ways as a fire. I love fires. Like, I love the fall time when the temperature dips below 60 degrees because I believe it just gives me an excuse to start a fire in our fireplace or to go outside and light up our fireplace in the backyard. I love fires because why? Fires bring warmth. I love the feeling of being cold and then getting near a fire and just feeling that warmth. And it's a place of joy. I love taking my kids and my wife outside and us making s'mores and just laughing together and experiencing joy. Fires are representative of joy and warmth. And that's what God desires for you when it comes to sex, is warmth and joy. But what you need to make sure of, you have to make sure that you give yourself to the right type of fire. See, we started by talking about virtual sex, but what you need to realize is if you settle for virtual sex, this is the type of fire that you're settling for right here. It's just a virtual fire. That's it, man. Oh, ooh, gosh, so cold. Oh, you know what would just make this better, man? Let's roast some s'mores. Oh my gosh, just give me a second. Anyone want one? Because I'm just going to heat this sucker up real quick. Anyone? How many of you guys look at this and be like, what a fool? To stand there and warm yourself by a fire that isn't real. But that's what you're doing. Anytime you give yourself to virtual sex, man, you're trying to warm yourself by a fake fire. It's not real. Some of you guys, you're going to give yourself to casual sex. And so, you know what you're going to do is you're just going to, man, this is college. And so you just want to enjoy yourself and kind of get around and experience whatever you can. And so, you know what you do? Man, you get a bottle of lighter fluid, because you know what lighter fluid does? Man, it just takes things to the next level. And so, man, this is just your lust. This is your passion. This is your hormones. It's college for crying out loud. And so, man, you just want to douse. You just want to have all of these different experiences where, man, you just enjoy college. I mean, that's it. And so, man, you just want to, just joking. Okay, that's not going to happen. But you think about casual sex. You think about lighter fluid in casual sex. It's kind of like you become a middle schooler with a bottle of lighter fluid. What happens when middle schoolers get lighter fluid? Man, they're just looking for a good time. They're looking for a big flare. And so what you do is you kind of haphazardly and carelessly kind of go to different people on campus, and you have different experiences where you're just looking for a big flare. It doesn't take any work. It doesn't take any effort. All it takes is a little bit of alcohol maybe to kind of loosen you up. And what happens when you light lighter fluid is it burns up and it gives you this big flare up. But when all of the lighter fluid burns off the log, you know what you realize? There was never really any fire. There's no warmth. There's no warmth. All there is this big flash, this big moment. And then there's nothing. And so, whereas some people with virtual sex settle for a fake fire, those who give themselves to casual sex just settle for a cheap fire. And then there's forced sex. And this right here, this is called a weed torch. It's a flamethrower. And I'm not going to light this thing up right now because that is actually against the law. But you know what this thing is meant to do? This thing is meant to burn things down. And so what a few of you will do in here is you will come with your impulses and you will torch someone's life. And you just imagine a flame just engulfing this little candle. And you leave someone's life feeling damaged and used. And so some of you guys, yeah, you're settling for a fake fire. Others of you are settling for a cheap fire. A few of you are settling for a destructive fire. You know what it really is? It's arson. It's arson. It's a crime. A few of you, though, are going to get a vision tonight for something better. You're going to get a vision for biblical sex, and you're going to choose to believe that God's way is the best way. See, God has, you know what? Fires belong in certain places, and there's other places fires don't belong. Fires are great, but fires aren't great when they're in the middle of your living room floor. But fires are great for fire pits. Why? Because the fire pit is meant to hold the fire. God hasn't created marriage for sex, but he has created sex for marriage. Why? Because marriage can hold the fire of sex. It can. It's been built to hold the fire of sex. And so I can comfortably stand around a fire that's in a fire pit because there's safety and security. Just like in marriage, there's the safety and security of commitment. And not only that, there's an extended period of time where, man, you are building this fire with an emotional and a spiritual connection before there's ever a physical element to things. Man, you're building this fire with with connecting emotionally, spiritually. I wasn't a Boy Scout, so I did my best. Hopefully you can still see those logs, but you put in the time. You put in the time. And you cultivate it, and then it takes a process of gathering kindling. Man, gathering kindling, it takes time for you to go out and grab brush and leaves to cultivate a healthy fire. But you know what you do? You know what happens? When you have the right amount of emotional connection and spiritual connection, and then you pour a little bit of your desire to be together physically, to become one, which is a natural desire that God has put inside of each of you. You have a fire that is prepared by God. And here's the thing, we're not going to light this tonight. You want to know why we're not going to light it? Because you're not here yet. Because you're not married yet. But you need to know that you have a God holding the match. He is holding the match, ready to light it and ignite this fire because he loves you. And that's his way of saying, I'm well pleased with you. Thank you for waiting. It's worth it. He's a God who loves you and cares about you. You have to choose which way you're going to go. The reality is some of you guys are going to walk out of here tonight and you're going to choose to settle for a fake fire or a cheap fire or even a destructive fire. And the reason that will happen is because you've bought into the lie that sex is ultimate. You're going to buy into the lie that sex is God. You're going to make sex out to be God. You're going to buy into the lie that sex is the greatest source of pleasure in this world. But I just need you to hear me say, sex isn't the greatest source of pleasure in this world. Sex isn't God. Sex is just a gift from God. Sex is just a gift from the greatest source of pleasure in this world. Sex isn't the greatest source of pleasure. It's just a gift from the only one who is the truly greatest source of pleasure. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. Psalm 16:11 says this, you make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are what? Pleasures forevermore. See, what sex will do is it will give you moments of pleasure. But you want to know who's sitting at the right hand of the Father? Jesus Christ. God's saying at my right hand, Jesus Christ, in him are pleasures forevermore. He's the greatest source of pleasure. Maybe tonight you can experience the pleasure of coming into the family of God. Maybe you've never begun a relationship with Jesus. He went to the cross, he died. He was buried in a tomb. He walked out of that tomb on the third day. Why? To give you an invitation into the family of God so that the God of the universe could call you his child. Maybe tonight you'll experience that pleasure. Maybe some of you are going to experience the pleasure of forgiveness. You don't need to walk out of here feeling like you've failed or you've screwed it all up and there's no hope for you. No, you can embrace the pleasure of knowing that God is in the business of newness. And so your story is that you are new from this day forward. I don't see anything wrong with you coming to your spouse and saying, I made a decision on that night in April a few years ago where I decided I was going to be a virgin from that day forward for you. Maybe you experience that pleasure. Maybe you experience the pleasure of being single. And you have this season of life where God can secure an undistracted devotion to him. Maybe you can experience the pleasure of being used by him to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. Maybe you can experience the pleasure of being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. That's why you even exist, is to look as much like Jesus as possible. But sex isn't God. Sex is just a gift from God. Sex isn't the greatest source of pleasure. It's just a gift from the true greatest source of pleasure, and that's Jesus Christ. Do you know him? Will you follow him? Will you believe tonight that when it comes to sex, he's just not about what not to do. He actually tells us what to do, and his way is the best way. Would you believe that?